All right, so it looks like it's 12 o'clock. I really appreciate everybody signing in. I have started the recording. This is a webinar that we'll record so that we can share it later, both on our website at oeo.wa.gov, and also we have a YouTube channel so that if you miss out on parts or you want to circle back or share it with someone, check there later. We do go through a process of adding closed captioning before we upload. So if you'll give us some time to get that done, we'll get this up online. Folks that were registered as of a couple hours ago, I'd sent out an email with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and we can send that around again afterwards as well. So just again, briefly, we will be recording as we go. My co-presenter, Sam Blazina, will be joining us in just a moment. You'll notice a few things as we go along. We've set this up with some hypothetical scenarios, hoping to talk through some ideas. Maybe a frustrating element of working with Ombuds, but we often have as many questions as we have answers or suggestions. And so we are really hoping that everyone who's joined us today will feel free to add follow-up questions, suggestions, what you find useful and effective as we go along. To do that, we don't have a way to give you a speaking voice today, but we do have the chat feature that you can use. You can also submit some ideas or questions via the Q&A there, the feature through the webinar. So you can use chat, type in a question or a thought or a resource, and use Q&A. And we will keep our eye on those as we go through to make sure we can follow up and share information. One more time, we are recording, so you'll be able to find this again later online. So we will, as soon as my co-panelist joins me, we will introduce her briefly. My name is Rose Spidell. I'm one of the Senior Education Ombuds that works with the Washington State Governor's Office of the Education Ombuds. And so what is that? Well, just briefly, let me see if I can get my slideshow moving. Here we are. It's a brief history of the OEO, Office of Education Ombuds. We are a small state agency. We are situated under the governor's office. That was a choice by the legislature to make our agency independent of the state education agency. So independent of OSPI, Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, independent of school districts, but connected and able to serve as a resource for families, educators, community professionals around navigating our state's K-12 public school system, participating in conversations around policy and how to make the system responsive and an effective place to serve all students, addressing and tackling troubling and persistent opportunity gaps that impact students in our schools, particularly students of color, Native American students, African American, Latino, Asian American, and Pacific Islander, and also students with disabilities. So that was the creation of our office by the legislature back in 2006. We've been going for a while now. And we, as an office, do our work in what we call or think of, oops, excuse me, sorry about that, a little bit of craziness on the movement there. So this is what we do in terms of 3 buckets of work is what we call it. Doing work individually with families, we call that our casework. We also, oops, excuse me, sorry, just a moment. We also, so in our casework, we talk directly with families. We share information about different school processes. We also get calls directly from community professionals and sometimes from educators. And in that process, we try to help come up with ideas, serve as a sounding board as they're resolving issues or concerns relating to a student in public education. We also do trainings and outreach. That's part of our online work, but also we do in-person work, and we participate in a number of policy discussions. We are a small team. There are 7 of us, and so we try to get out and about and be responsive as much as our small size allows. But we really, in being able to effectively serve families, students, educators, and the community, we rely so much on the connections and partnerships with others. And so much of what we do is we learn about the good work that other folks are doing and try to connect families directly with you. So if you will give me just a moment, I am going to pause and try to do a little troubleshooting. Oh, there we go. We've got our second panelist here, Sam Blazina. I would like to welcome Sam. And hi, Sam.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Don't you love technology?
Yeah.
All right, I'm on.
Yeah. Sam, I don't know if you want to allow your video to show or not.
Sure, we could do that.
Yeah. So I had just been describing OEO, the 3 buckets of work we do, a brief history of the creation of our office, and we'll be getting ready to jump in. So I'd mentioned I'm Rose, I'm one of the senior education ombuds, and Sam is another one of our senior education ombuds. Sam, you have a little bit different role than I do in the sense that you're regional. And can you tell the audience a little bit about where you're based and what that allows you to do?
Yes, I could do that. Hi, everybody. I work, I'm regionally placed in the eastern Washington part of the state. I'm actually in Little Ellensburg, Kittitas County. So I cover mostly east and central Washington areas. And do a lot of the sort of the outreach to some of the communities around here in our areas. And then we have our other colleagues that cover mostly the west side there. So we have a lot of representation sort of reaching out to the 4 corners of the state.
Yes, indeed. And so it's great to be able to physically be in the different areas of the state because we can't effectively do that through all the 4 corners. We do a lot of our work by phone. And so if you have folks who have questions or want to see if we can connect directly, we've got contact information at the end of this slideshow. So I want to go ahead and get us going to dive in. Let's just preview our agenda here for today. We're going to be talking about troubleshooting issues around special education services, particularly imagining situations that come up for students who are in foster care or in kinship care. Certainly these issues don't come up for all students, and there's just so many varieties of the situations that children and their families live in. So we're just trying to troubleshoot things that come up, can be really challenging, but also that there are some resources and ways to address it when they do arise. And so here we've got an outline of the kind of issues we're hoping to touch on, and we are going to do that by using a couple of hypothetical scenarios, fictionalized characters here that experience different situations. We're going to be thinking about a couple of questions in this process. One is, what are some of the things we can do to problem solve or address concerns after an issue arises? So we'll see in the scenario, what do we do after the fact when we realize there's an issue? We're also going to be thinking about, particularly with some of the scenarios, what are some of the things we could do differently in the future to avoid this kind of problem? Sometimes it'll be possible, other times we just have to be ready to respond when an issue comes up. So right before I switch to the next slide and Sam will read through our first hypothetical, I just want to remind folks and invite you, please feel free and don't be shy about using chat or Q&A. Add in your own questions, add in your own thoughts, and we'll keep an eye on that. All right, so Sam, can you kind of give us an outline of the first scenario that we're going to work from?
Yes, I can. We have a 4th grader student who has a current IEP that was updated in last October, and the IEP shows that the student receives 100 minutes per day of specially designed instruction in reading and math only in the special education setting in a resource room. And starting in January, her teachers start to see a change in the behavior. So students not participating in class, asking to go to the bathroom, missing a lot of class time, going to the nurse's office, leaving the room without saying anything. She's spending more time in the resource room and school with counselor. In February, she leaves campus during recess and tries to walk home. So the team requests additional support as a temporary para is assigned. Well, in March, student was placed in a foster care and goes to live with her aunt. And this is clearly on the other side of the state. Student goes, starts the new school, and the IEP states the same, that she gets 100 minutes a day in resource room, but the IEP did not reflect a reference to a para.
Right. And apologize, my roaming finger is making it difficult to stay focused on the slide. Okay, so we've got the situation. Issues have been coming up in the year. It sounds like the team is trying to be responsive and provide supports, but we get to the next school district and the documentation doesn't follow. So in this scenario, we imagine that the student does need to change school districts. Now, we know that when a student transfers from one district to another and already has an IEP in place, the new district needs to be able to take a look at that IEP, which is the written plan, and implement it as closely as they can to what has been written in that plan. What do we do if that plan doesn't reflect all of the latest changes, and importantly in this circumstance, some significant new supports and shifts that were made in the last few months before the student moved? What are some thoughts? Here again, I'm going to invite you, if you have some immediate thoughts or recommendations or other questions, jump in. Some of the questions, right off, what about asking for a team meeting? What about asking that the sending district send all records and check specifically for what we call a PWN, or a prior written notice? A prior written notice is something that a lot of times you'll find it actually stapled right to the back of an IEP, just as part of a packet. And sometimes we can kind of flip past and not give much attention to it. It's often attached to an IEP because it will describe sort of decisions and things that a team considered when they were updating or amending an IEP. But a prior written notice can also come separate from an IEP. So say, for example, the IEP continues in place, but a request has been made, say, for a functional behavior assessment or other kind of evaluation. Or maybe a request has been made by one of the IEP team members to consider adding additional supports, maybe in the form of a para. Those kind of requests then, once they're received by a district, and it can be any team member, it could be a parent or it could be a teacher who says, I think for the safety of this student, we need additional supports. That request gets made, it should be documented, and the written notice should describe what the decision is going to be about that request. Now, sometimes as the team is really focused in, here they had issues of safety concern come up. They're trying to problem solve and troubleshoot. What happens if it didn't get documented, if there was no written notice that put this down on paper? And so you get to that new district and they're looking at putting in place the same supports that are in the written IEP, right? What can you do next? And so I certainly think that start with an IEP team meeting right away is going to be critical. Circling back to get as much information as you can from the former district will be important. Sam, do you have other thoughts that you would add here? And I'd also invite folks on listening in, other ideas of what you might look for here or suggest.
Sorry, I can't get my video. I think you have me disabled for the video. I tried.
Okay, sure.
Well, no, I think you really touched on a lot of the important parts here. I think the communication clearly stating, what you're requesting, what your concerns are in terms of evaluations, what kinds of evaluations will the school be doing, just really understanding that process. I think it's really important here to develop that relationship, and so there's clarity about what you expect. Often, sometimes things may happen that you're not expecting, and so there's a little bit of frustration there. So really ask the questions ahead of time and get very clarity about what this all looks like.
Right. And one of the things that comes up sometimes, whether you're dealing with a student who's moving and in transition to foster care or otherwise, or any student, is that when this issue in particular about additional support from a paraeducator or an instructional assistant comes up, that is often a time when a district will say, we need some district level people involved in this process to determine if it's necessary, and if so, when and for how long. The key thing to note is that if there's a question of whether a student with an IEP needs that level of support to be able to continue to stay in a gen ed class or access their instruction, that really is an IEP team decision. Now, an IEP team really does need to include a district representative. Sometimes that role is filled by a person who works at the school. It could be the principal. Sometimes it's even one of the special ed teachers or providers. But if you're starting to talk about the possible need for additional staff, it's a good time to give a call to the district special ed office and see if one of the supervisors or assistant directors can plan to be at a meeting. You want to have everyone there as soon as possible so you can have the conversation. What data would we need? Do we have it? Do we need other information? What other things do we need to make a decision about what's necessary to support this student? All right, so this is one where we have some after the fact steps. I would say if there's a lesson to be learned going to avoid a situation like this going forward, is that anytime you're supporting a student with an IEP, and especially if it's a student whose living situation might be in flux, where there's a possibility that they might be moving from one school to another, one district to another. Sometimes I think we think, well, the important part is what we're doing day to day, and the paperwork can wait. The paperwork isn't as essential. This hypothetical reminds us of why the paperwork matters so much, because it is what would direct that new district in terms of what kind of supports they'd need to be ready to provide when the student comes to their school. All right. So again, don't feel shy. If you have some follow-up thoughts, add them in. Here we go. We're going to continue with the same student and now tackle some transportation pieces. I'm going to read out the hypo and at the same time take a quick look at the Q&A because someone has added in. So let me read the hypo here so we can get started thinking about it, and then I'm going to circle back to the comment question. So here we have the fourth grader. Before she left in her former school, she was able to walk to school or get a ride. So she didn't have transportation on the bus. In the new school, she's still struggling with that elopement behavior, leaving a classroom, trying to leave school. And she started to have troubles with peer interaction. When the bus drops her off at the new school, she gets off and runs straight to the bathroom and is there until a teacher goes to find her. The student's on the bus with one of her younger cousins who goes and tells her mom, the student's aunt, that others are bullying her, both at school and on the bus. All right, so here we've got transportation issues, we've got potential bullying at a bus stop, on the bus, at school, and remember she came from a situation where she wasn't on the bus before. So Sam, can I have you walk us through the questions from this, and then I'll circle back to the question that we got from one of our participants.
Sure. So in this situation, so you have a student who has not experienced a bus before, has not had a lot of peer interaction in that sort of a setting. So requesting an IEP meeting, perhaps, to talk with the team about what's happening in the bus. The student is starting to demonstrate some behavior here, and to try to understand what the behavior is. Often is related to their experience that something is happening and may be causing that. So to in this particular situation, look at requesting specialized transportation with maybe some supports, a different bus. It could be a student that is in the bus that is, there might be a little bit of a peer-to-peer sort of a conflict or a concern there. And if it's a bowling issue, there are steps that you could take in addressing that or attempting to address is to file a report. Every school district, you could go to their website and they should have some information in there. Usually you'll find it under the board of a school board, under policies and procedures. Typically is number 3000 or so. It gives you all the policies and procedures for the school district and how to follow those steps to file a bullying report. But wrapping back, you're starting with that IEP team meeting to talk about, what's happening, try to really pinpoint what some of the causes are, because clearly the student is really running away from something here. She moves on to this new school where now she's taking a bus. She goes right to the bathroom, so she's kind of hiding out a little bit there and doesn't come out until the teacher comes and get her. So in another step here, perhaps requesting a meeting with the principal to discuss the overall issue, the transportation, and there are two pieces here. The transportation is a related service, and it should be stated in the IEP. If the student needs, if the team deems that there needs to be some supports in the bus, perhaps that's the conversation that the IEP team needs to have to support the student. I even would throw it in there, Rose, potential for a functional behavior assessment to where there could be a little bit of a different sets of eyes and lenses to do some assessment in the bus where a professional can ride the bus discreetly and sort of observe what's going on in there to kind of bring some perspective back to the team to determine whether or not it is a harassment, intimidation, bullying. Most school buses do have a camera that you could also view that as to determine what could potentially be the cause.
Great. Yeah, and I think you're right. So you touched on several things. So looking at the student's behavior of trying to escape different settings, so that elopement. So when you're looking at a student's behavior, you might be looking at a functional behavior assessment. You also mentioned, putting in a report about the bullying. Those reports generally will go to a school building principal, and the principal will be a key person or assistant principal in getting to the bottom of that, troubleshooting it, right? An IEP team can also be helpful. And here's the comment we had from one of our participants. I'm going to share it also via chat, which is, whenever possible, try to include the social worker when there's a student in out-of-home placement, because they might have additional information about the child's medical or educational history and needs. That can be so key. And the other thing that we're seeing here is when you have that time of transition, it can change the setting and the context enough that you change the needs, right? So some needs we might be able to anticipate in advance, but others will come up in relation to what are you going to encounter in this new school. Here, there now is the added situation of the bus, which we know can be a difficult time where bullying and harassment can occur, but there are problem-solving tools. Like you mentioned, Sam, sometimes they could put an adult on the bus to take a look at what's going on. They could review some videos. They could think about, it might be that riding the bus with her cousin is an important way for her to stay connected there. But is there a way to make it a safer, more successful time? Also, looking at what is this behavior signaling, and it could be that you could get some really critical insights from those folks who are working with the student outside of school, so that this new school they can troubleshoot. Here, if there is a need for some specialized support on that bus, again, look back to the IEP. If the team considers it and makes a decision, let's take the learning from the first scenario and make sure it gets documented, both in the IEP and in a prior written notice that describes the conversation that took place and the decision that was made. So, this is a scenario where the team did change schools, and we can see that getting a meeting together soon is really impossible, and there are going to be some key people to involve in that meeting who have the current information about the student, not just what's in the papers, but also beyond that. All right, so as we continue to the next slide, if folks have other follow-up tips or questions or thoughts on this, please let us know. I know one of the areas that does sometimes come up, and you referenced it, Sam, which is around bullying and harassment. Most districts do have an incident reporting form, and Sometimes the school person would fill that out themselves, but quite often it is a student or a family member. It could be the foster parent, the aunt here, who might fill that out to make sure that there's a thorough investigation into what's going on and a process to follow up on that. All right, so we are ready to switch to our next scenario. Just before you go ahead and describe it for us, Sam, I want to invite and see if folks, again, don't be shy to type in your questions, thoughts, and we'll go ahead and go through. What have we got for our second student?
We have a 10th grader who was diagnosed with ADHD in elementary school. He passed his classes prior to 10th grade. 9th grade, he did well. He still receives specially designed instruction in organizational skills in a special ed setting. He's now failing second semester of science and math. He's barely passing the other classes. He's currently staying with his older sister. The science teacher seeing behavior, the student is out of class and not following directions. He's been sent to the office in the last 2 weeks and being very disruptive and disrespectful. Student has started skipping PE classes. He's gotten in arguments with the vice principal. He was emergency expelled on a Friday for threatening the science teacher, who called him out in the hallway, and the student yelling and using profanity. Told the teacher he better get off his back or he'd be sorry. So there's a lot of behavior here. Student has a behavior intervention plan that was from last year that addressed disruptive, interrupting behavior in class.
All right, great. So as you mentioned, a lot of behavior, and I think fair to assume a lot of fairly intense emotions behind that. And I think in situations like this, and when we're problem solving, especially supporting a young person who's going through transitions, is, I think undeniably it's a difficult time if you are leaving home, looking for a different safe space to be. You've got that conflict at home. There's a lot going on. And teenagers generally, some of them are gonna struggle with the dynamics in a school setting when they're regularly told what to do and how to do it. And if a teenager is under stress and anxious and dealing with the trauma of conflict at home, it can just make it that much more difficult. So it's really important to look at and think about the behavior of the student and think about it non-judgmentally if we can, but also keep an eye on and think about how are the adults, how are we responding and behaving in relationship to this young person. Does our behavior, does our response unintentionally escalate the emotional state or make the student feel safe or unsafe? So here, just to say, as we get started thinking about this scenario and what to do, is think about both the student and the adults. How are adults responding to this? And what are the consequences of the choices of those behaviors? We have a series of questions here about troubleshooting. Remember, this 10th grader has been expelled. So before I go right into those, I want to acknowledge we have a follow-up question and relates to the role of a social worker. It's a helpful one. There might be a social worker here working with the 10th grader, certainly working with the younger student. And there's a question as we're working through these processes that are formal legal processes. At what point is, or are they ever, the social worker required to sign any portion of the IEP or documents related to child's education services? So that's a good question. And the question there is about required to sign. And it actually opens up a whole area of discussion and question that often comes up, which is, what does it mean to sign an IEP? Because there's two very different kinds of signatures that come up in this context. One is to acknowledge that you participated in the process of reviewing the IEP and developing it. And if a social worker is part of a student's IEP team, contributing information and ideas to that team, and you want to acknowledge your participation in that IEP team development process, then that signature can reflect participation in a meeting or in a process. There's a really different kind of signing, which is the signing necessary to give consent. A parent, quote unquote, consent is necessary to initiate special ed services. Parents' consent is necessary to move forward with evaluation. That's parent or an adult student. We have some slides a bit later on that where I've put in a link actually to the specific definition of parent under the special ed laws. And it's worth taking a look at what the rules say about parent, because they are very particular. And a parent can be a biological or adoptive parent, can be a foster parent, it can be another adult acting in the role of a parent, but it cannot be the state. So take a look at that definition. We'll get to that in a little bit. You'll see the highlighted word parent, and you can follow that and take a look, because a social worker can be they serve so many roles in this process, but they do not serve in the role as parent, and that is clear under the special ed rules. So we do have a student here who has been removed from school, emergency expulsion due to a perceived threat. What next, right? There's actually a fair number of options to think through, and it might be that this young person, I imagine him as a boy, a young man, with his sister would say to themselves, you know what, I don't think this discipline at all is appropriate. That was not intended as a threat. It was misunderstood. I'd like to challenge the discipline, period. And so they could access the procedures for challenging discipline just as any student. Maybe they are thinking, you know what, it was an inappropriate choice of words. We can see where it came from, but I believe that this was a manifestation of his disability, and that his disability played into and had a direct relationship to the behavior here, or that the hypo referenced that there was a behavior plan in place. If you looked at the behavior plan and it describes certain things that adults would or wouldn't do, or supports the student would or wouldn't get, if that had not been followed, they could say, we believe this was a result of the district's failure to implement the IEP, because the behavior plan is incorporated into the IEP. So we understand that as part of the IEP. So in that case, they might be asking about, can we do a manifestation determination meeting? That's a meeting that the district must arrange to have if the student's out for 10 days, by the 10th day. And at that meeting, the student, the parent, and relative members of the IEP team get together and decide, was this a manifestation or not? And if it was, then they take a look back at the functional behavior assessment and behavior plan. Also, if it was, that student returns to school, right? In the meantime, definitely hope people will be asking those questions about, how does the student keep up while he's out, right? And so one of the key changes, our state discipline rules and laws have been under revision. We've had a couple updates over the last 5 years, and one of the most significant recent updates is that all students who are suspended or expelled need to continue to have access to educational services. That means any suspension or expulsion, including ones that are 10 days or less. And so you really want to be talking right away. This is a student who more or less is really trying to keep up with his grades. He's in high school, he's trying to earn credits. Let's be talking right away about, even if he's out for just 10 days, how do we help him keep up? Now, we'll switch to the next slide and continue with this scenario, but right before we do, we have another follow-up question. And I just really appreciate these questions, so keep them coming, which is the manifestation determination meeting only required for kids on IEPs that were expelled? Well, the answer is no, because kids who have a 504 plan, a Section 504 plan, also, if they are expelled or suspended and it's more than 10 days, or 10 days, there should be a manifestation determination process. Why? because the manifestation determination is about asking the question of whether this student's behavior or conduct was caused by the disability, right? And the idea is if this was caused by their disability or a failure to implement the plan that is to address the needs related to their disability, it's not fair to punish them by continuing to exclude them from school and deny them access to that placement that they'd had. And so it's around that question of whether the conduct was related to disability. Some students with disabilities qualify for an IEP, others have a 504 plan. So I hope that helps. And we'll continue on to read the next, what happened next in this scenario, which will bring us to some more questions. So I'll read the scenario this time and then Sam will guide us through those questions. All right. So in this case, the district, the parent, and here's where I have that asterisk, it should be hyperlinked to the definition in the Washington Administrative Code, the WACS. And relevant members of the student's team meet for a manifestation determination meeting. The sister, who in this situation may well be serving as the parent, right? She is an adult that he's living with that's acting in the role of a parent. She goes and believes that the behavior was a manifestation of his disability and also a failure to implement the behavior intervention plan. But other members of the team disagree and decide it was not a manifestation. Now let me circle back briefly to the parent piece, because a parent can be different people. The one thing that the rules note is that if the biological or adoptive parent is attempting to act as the parent under the chapter, then that person must be treated as the parent. So if in this scenario, the student had left to live with his sister because of conflict in the home, but say his mom remained involved and was going to attend this meeting and wanted to participate in this decision, and she was engaging with his educational services, then the parent, the mom, would be treated as the parent in this situation. So again, I really encourage, always double check back, read the language of that part of the rules, which you can hyperlink there, because it does really give some specifics and some guidance of what to do if there are different people involved. Just to give you the citation, if the hyperlink doesn't work, it's our state rules, WAC 392-172A-01125. All right. So the school converts the emergency expulsion to a long-term suspension to last for the remaining 35 days of the semester. The school tells the family they need to get a risk assessment before the student can return. They talk about setting up some tutoring services to take place at the district office, and they agree to do an early re-eval. All right, Sam?
Yes. So here we have a student that is now looking at an alternative education setting. They still need to receive FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education, up to those 45 days of the semester. So they can't be a breach in that time. So the student must be able to continue to participate in general curriculum, even though is at a different setting. And the amount of service or hours of tutoring or the curriculum that the student is going to receive, it really is determined by the IEP team. And that they'll look at the amount of minutes in the IEP, what is the area that the student is receiving the specialized instruction for, and come up with some kind of a formula to be able to continue to provide that FAPE. That re-engagement must happen within the 20 days of removal and no later than 5 days before the student has to re-engage in school. And it's really important to have this meeting, have this conversation, so this can be an effective re-engagement, so there can be an understanding of why the student was expelled to begin with. So that re-engagement is to have a conversation about that determination of manifestation, what are some of the potential triggers, which in the educational world we call it antecedents. So it's a very important sort of a underlying conversation to have, so that there is no reoccurring. We don't want to have a snowball effect here that's going to continue to grow. So that conversation is very, very important. An assessment can be done to determine whether or not, specific areas that can be of assistance to the IEP team, maybe potential revisions of the IEP, make sure that all of those pieces that are in there are going to be effective if they were not the original issue where the student started to have problems with. The school is essentially responsible for doing these assessments for the student. And the areas of concern that should be included in the evaluation would be the areas of concern that brought the student there to begin with. So that's why documenting here and looking at all the records and having a good understanding of the chronology of the events that led the student to be expelled to begin with, having a good baseline of conversation so you can move forward from there and not, to go backwards. So you evaluate in that specific area. Now we need to keep in mind this is a student who is going through some trauma. So, so that could be that needs to be a part of a conversation here, whether, or not that needs to be addressed and how it can be addressed.
Right. Great. And you mentioned several really key things, keeping those services going, that they sometimes what we hear is, so a student with an IEP is out of school, and so we know we have to do interim services. And so sometimes we'll hear that they're offered 2 hours of tutoring a week, or maybe an hour 3 times a week, right? And that sort of gets put on the table. This is what we're going to do. The key thing to keep in mind is it really is up to the IEP team to determine what's necessary to define those appropriate services during the time that the student's out. The other thing that we hear sometimes is that those hours of tutoring, the district might be really on top of making sure that they have someone who can address each of the goal areas for the student's IEP, so all the areas of specially designed instruction. Well, don't forget that those need to include the opportunity for the student to keep up with the gen ed curriculum. Especially for a student like this, that's going to be critical, right? If he only got tutoring to cover his area of specially designed instruction, he could risk really falling behind and not being able to complete any of those classes he's been in. So tutoring needs to include general education and special education. It should be addressed by the IEP team and not simply here's what we offer to every kid in this situation. And then that risk assessment piece, we hear this coming up more and more. It really, especially when they're talking about an assessment to understand, a threat assessment or a mental health assessment, those are things that a school district needs to provide if they believe it's relevant to the student's education and their ability to be there and be safe. It also should not circumvent the special ed rules. Remember back, if they had decided it was a manifestation, the student should return to school, and that should not be conditioned on, well, we're going to wait and also get this threat assessment, right? So sometimes the interaction between those things can get complicated. And then the other thing I would highlight that Sam said is re-engagement meetings. These are for every kid who's suspended or expelled for more than 20 days. And you don't wait until the day before they return. In fact, if the suspension is for more than 20 days, then you get together at least within 20 days of when they left and start talking about how do we get back earlier. I think one of the things is sometimes we think for kids with IEPs, there's already so much process around it. We already had the manifestation determination meeting. We know they're going to get interim services. Do we need to do that re-engagement meeting thing? Well, yes, because exactly as Sam said, you don't want it to be a revolving situation. Before we move on to the next one, we have another few questions to follow up on this. We have another follow-up question, and thank you. Are there situations in which the input of the social worker would be required in determining, quote, who's the parent? On this one, I'm just going to briefly go back and look at that definition of parent again, because I think it does help answer. And again, I just really encourage, take a look at that. There's also one of the definitions, one of the options within the definition of parent is if you don't have a biological or adoptive parent, if you don't have a foster parent, if you don't have a guardian who's generally authorized or someone who's acting in the place of a parent, then sometimes it becomes necessary to identify a surrogate parent. And each district should have some detailed procedure around how they would do that if the need arises. It does say if the biological parent is attempting to act, and when more than one person meets the qualification, it's the biological or adoptive parent who's presumed to be the parent, unless he or she does not have legal authority to make educational decisions. And here's where sometimes within the court process, a judge might consider a question of whether or not someone other than the biological or adoptive parent should be identified as the person responsible for making educational decisions and serving as the parent. And so the special ed rules acknowledge that there may be a situation where a judge would enter an order that would identify someone other than that parent as having the educational decision-making authority. In the absence of a judge doing that, then it is the parent who retains that educational decision-making authority. So the input of a social worker, really that the whole court process is a little to the outside of my area of familiarity, but I would imagine in that process is really a place where the social worker, working with the other people involved, is going to be able to share important information about whether or who is maybe well situated or not to make those educational decisions. So that might be in that court process, if a judge is considering that, might be a place where a social worker would have a role. So let's continue with some of these. So this scenario, I thought Sam provided some great opportunity to ask some of these questions about, could we avoid a situation like this? I mean, we don't want to get to a place where a student who's already experiencing significant disruption to also be expelled from school.
Yeah, so what might be some of the early signs that the student's needs have changed? One would be the behavior, right? You have a student who's suddenly behaving differently. That is an early sign. And I think that having that accurate documentation, open communication with the classroom teacher in whatever room that the student is in to do observations and to really nib it early in the stages of the behavior. Students' needs will change. In this situation, we're talking about students that are, moving around. They're having some, experiencing a different life, and they're going to bring that to school with them. So I think in that bridging that life change into school, whoever this legal guardian or person or social worker that is working with the student to keep that open line of communication with the school would be really important. I like to kind of add that in there to let school know and the providers at school that, okay, I really would like to keep a closer eye on the student, but right at the beginning, you'll see that. You'll see that in classroom. You'll see that in their demeanor, how they're talking, how it's impacting their grade, their homework. Is it being done? I mean, we have a lot of school records. It's really trying to triage all of that. Considering an FBA, this is very important. I think right away. We don't need to have 40 referrals to determine that the student needs to have a functional behavior assessment. And I think that equally important, if you have a functional behavior assessment, that be done and revised, because often functional behavior assessments are done and you're looking at environments. If a student has changed an environment, that's going to be, different triggers are going to exist. And you're not going to know that if you have a functional behavior assessment that is a year old from a different grade level, with a different classroom, with different supports, or even in this situation, potentially a different city or school district. So I think the FBAs need to be revised very carefully. I think it needs to be a conversation to have continuously as an IEP team, whether or not it's needed. And then have that behavior intervention plan, which it really needs to also be tweaked, because one behavior intervention plan doesn't mean it's going to work. We're doing this by trial and error. So you have a group of folks that are going to come together, try to make some determination of a behavior and some of the triggers for the behavior. So we're going to write a behavior intervention plan, and that needs to be reconsidered as needed. Again, having real tight records and open communication with the classroom, and to do it right away and not to allow it to escalate, because we really want to minimize the impact of the trauma that the student has already had. And trauma-informed is a big conversation we're having these days with trauma-informed. We have a lot of kids in school that have suffered trauma. It's very important so the folks that are working with the student to understand what kind of trauma that the student is dealing with. I think it's the IEP team to bring in the expertise into that conversation, to be able to write an IEP, to be able to support the student in a manner that it's going to be effective. There are a lot of resources out there to do this. So the tools I would say here would be to reach out to the folks that are working with the student. And I like that about the question about the social worker. Social worker have a lot of knowledge and information if we're talking about a student in foster care, kinship and such, that they can bring to the team. So bridging those two lines there are very important, because I think that's a very reciprocal kind of a relationship.
Great. Yeah, and here we'll go over, you mentioned, like you said, don't wait until things get, 40 referrals, expulsion to talk about the functional behavior assessment. You can get going on that early. And this slide is just a sample of a simple request for one. Schools are required to do a functional behavior assessment if there's that 10-day removal. Manifestation says yes, right? But that's doesn't limit the times when you can use it as a tool. Here, if we imagined, let's say it was this young person and he went to live with his sister, maybe there's not a social worker or other person involved yet, and he's there in the classroom with the science teacher, and the science teacher starts to get more and more frustrated with behavior that's disruptive and interrupted. I think about one of those things about trauma-informed is really about helping all the adults, all of us as people in the system, be ready to say, okay, I don't need to take it personally. I can try to understand where it's coming from. I may not even need to know or have, the expectation that someone's going to share with me all the, personal details of what's going on with this student. But I can still be ready to say, okay, if they're starting to act like this, and I notice I'm sending them out of class regularly, that's a sign to me, I better check back, right? And maybe also it would have been the principal or vice principal in this case who says, I'm seeing you here often, what's going on? So like you said, those early signs, people say that behavior communicates something. So especially if it hadn't been a constant and you notice a change, it's a good time for whoever it is around that student to start saying, whoa, what's going on? And can we dig into this, right? And so instead of taking it sort of feeling like, why are you disrespecting me? It can be, what's going on here? We seem to have an issue that's coming up. It's not what we've seen this whole time, right? And so then you engage this tool of a behavior assessment. If you're working with someone and they say, yeah, let's do a behavior assessment, well, just like anything else we do as professionals, sometimes we do a knockout excellent job, and other times we have plenty of room for improvement. So if you're looking at a behavior intervention plan, and just like Sam, you said, it's so critical. These are things that need to be reviewed, right? They're trial and error. If you get it, that's great. But you always want to go back. And the other thing you said, so critical, is that functional behavior assessment is looking at a behavior in a particular environment. So yes, like you said, this is a new year, new class, new context, things are changing. When you look at a behavior plan and you're thinking, are we set up for success here? Does that plan describe a behavior you can describe in concrete terms? Remember, if you're looking at a behavior plan and it says this student is disrespectful in class, I think each of us here could put an image in our mind of a young person acting disrespectfully, and we might all come up with something very different. And so to really address a behavior, we need to define it more concretely. It could be, for example, that when the teacher is talking, the student puts his head down or makes faces at the teacher and gets the attention of others to make them laugh, right? It could look something very different, but the key is being concrete. What we're doing is describing the behavior first without attaching judgment to it. The other thing is, so let's describe the behavior we don't want to see so we can address it. But don't forget to make sure that we're describing what we want to see as the appropriate behavior and how that's going to be taught and reinforced. Also, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about is sometimes the way that we respond to young people or to others can trigger an escalation of behaviors. And we can make choices about how we shift things or shift our engagement with students to reduce the triggers. And so the behavior plan should be clear about that. And be clear about that for everyone who might be involved. This is a high school student. I mean, if we started to count up the number of adults he might encounter in that school building on a day, average day, we're going to get to at least 10. So how could you describe something that everybody who's going to be interacting with him and working with him could look at it and everybody could understand and be consistent? And then just going back to what Sam says, are we going to have a plan to get together to review this? All right, so we are closing in on our last part, and this might just be one of the most important pieces. Sam, I'm going to read this scenario. It takes us as this student now. Fortunately, he did get some tutoring. He got his grade back up in math, but he did fail science and PE. He missed the state test, so but he took the reading and writing, doesn't know yet if he passed. But now he's starting to say, he used to say he wanted to go to college and work in environmental science, but now he says, hey, I just want to get a job and be done with this whole school thing. So Sam, can you talk to us what to do about keeping this student's eyes looking forward and making sure he has the supports he needs for that?
Yes, so this is a planning that I just wanted to preface that needs to start a little earlier. Really understanding graduation. And we're probably talking IDEA, and the Disabilities Education Act, states that it needs to start at 16, but they're even going a little bit earlier, the age of 14 now. So just to clarify, we should have a plan that's a little bit, starts a little earlier to determine whether or not the student will be credit bearing here or not, because there are different levels of, or types of graduations in terms of assessment certificates. So one of the options for the student would be to look at summer retrieval classes, courses that they could do. You could do a 5th year planning. So to stay there another year to be able to complete the school and the credit requirement. Now, keep in mind that school districts vary in their core credit requirements, the amount of credits. Typically, they're 24, but there are some schools that I have worked with, some students, they're up to 30 or 32, or no, 28. I think I just saw one. So really knowing what that credit requirement looks like and whether or not the student is going to be able to achieve that. So in this particular situation, Rose, I would say, I know we're coming up on our hour here, is to look at some of the options out there that are available, even talking with the school and the IEP team, whether or not they could do some kind of an alternative to extend it in the summer so that the student can graduate. And there are different assessments, there are alternative certificate here. And the transition planning part of it is really important. Reviewing the plan for graduation. And I want to, Rose, if you want to just go ahead and go to the next slide, because I think that one is going to wrap this up, and because we only have a couple of minutes. So I just mentioned that we really need to start this conversation at the age of 16, 14 if appropriate. And what is the track for him? He's a little confused. He want to do college, he may not want to do college. So that's a conversation that we need to center him. Very important. This is his future. It's his education. It's, he needs to be in the center of this whole conversation. And that's a hard thing to do sometimes. As IEP team members, we each have our role. And often we want to take on that role and sort of take on those choices that the student has. So take a step back and be a very student-centered focus. So what do you want? What is your track? And if they have enough records there, they've got years of school records that you can look at. There's a lot of good folks that have worked with the student, have documented, know them. Bring all of those people around the table to have this conversation. In terms of the independent living part, there are a lot of governmental agencies that can get involved here. So you school folks out there, you don't have to do this on your own. There's Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, where they can come in and sit around the table and actually sign up some kind of an agreement to do a pre-employment transition service for the student to understand what that looks like. which will then address the employment part. There are a lot of assessments out there. They're really good assessments. You don't have to create anything to determine the strengths that the student has. Self-advocacy skills. Those self-advocacy skills, you will see those in your IEPs. You know, in terms of equivalency, some of the things that the student can do, strengths and weaknesses. But bringing it all together here is have that plan and have it earlier. Do not wait until the 10th grade. I want to see the student in a little earlier having this plan already in place. Without having to really be too reactive. We need to be proactive. This is the future. And as a state, we're doing much better, but we still need to improve in our effective, successful graduation.
Yes. And Sam, I know it's totally unfair to ask you to cover this in 2 short minutes. I know because you've done a webinar around transition and continue to do workshops. So if folks really are interested in diving in deeper around transition, there is a recorded webinar on our YouTube channel and on our website, but also I know this is a conversation that definitely continues. As we wrap up, we just have one more resource slide for you where you can find the rules around discipline. A note that they are still in the process of updating the rules, so if you take a look at them, remember to take a look back in the fall. There'll be something different. And then lastly, please stay in touch with us. And don't hesitate to give us your feedback, your questions, your requests for other webinars that would be helpful to you or other formats. We so appreciate you participating and putting in your questions. Those are really helpful for us and hope that it allowed us to give you some helpful information. I thank you so much, Sam, for signing in. I apologize I wasn't able to get your video showing because we would have loved to see your smile today.
Oh, I'm good with that. We're good. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you so much. Watch later. We will get this up on our website. It might take a little bit. All right.
Thank you, Rose. See you all later.
Okay. Bye-bye.